The Prime Minister rules out the idea of a points-based immigration system, one of the Leave campaigners' key policies in the EU referendum. Speaking at the G20 summit in China, Theresa May says an Australian-style system is not the best way to control immigration.
I want a system where the government is able to decide who comes into the country. I think that's what the British people want. A points-based system means that people come in automatically if they just meet the criteria.
A sharp rebound for the UK's services sector after suffering a Brexit dip as new figures confound expectations. We'll have the latest from the summit in China, also this lunchtime. Pressure grows on the senior Labour MP Keith Vaz after a newspaper published allegations that he'd hired male escorts. Chaos around Calais as French farmers, lorry drivers and shopkeepers block roads to the port, demanding that the migrant camp be moved. The body that regulates the medical profession, the GMC, tells junior doctors their plans for 5-day strikes cannot be justified.
In the south, as tourism benefits from Brexit, we look at the long-term impact on foreign workers here in the south. And she snapped up the prize. We meet the first girl to win her top wildlife photography award.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. Theresa May has poured cold water on the idea of introducing a points-based system to control EU immigration. The measure was promised by Vote Leave campaigners before the referendum, but the Prime Minister has questioned whether such a process would work. UKIP leader Nigel Farage said he's very worried that the Prime Minister hasn't committed to an Australian-style points system. She's been speaking a short time ago at the end of the G20 summit of world leaders in China. Here's Ben Brown.
At the G20 summit, the Prime Minister's made it clear she does not believe an Australian points-based system is a silver bullet to control immigration.
What the British people voted for on the 23rd of June was to bring some control into the movement of people from the European Union into the UK. A points-based system does not give you that control. I want a system where the government is able to decide who comes into the country. I think that's what the British people want. A points-based system means that people come in automatically if they just meet the criteria.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing?
In the referendum campaign, Vote Leave leaders, including Boris Johnson, who's now the Foreign Secretary, promised that we will create a genuine Australian-style points-based immigration system.
17.4 million people voted for control of our borders, a drastic reduction on the numbers coming. And yeah, I mean, I've been campaigning for 10 years for an Australian-style points system. You could argue that's what led to the strength of UKIP and the referendum happening in the first place. I am concerned.
So how does the Australian system work? Well, points are awarded on the basis of an immigrant's age, qualifications, experience and ability to speak English, amongst other things. But many argue it's actually led to immigration in Australia going up per capita rather than coming down.
The points-based system they have in Australia actually operates to promote immigration. Proportionally, they've got 3 times as much immigration as we do. And if you look at the number of citizens in Australia who were born outside of that country, it's around 28%, so double the percentage that we have here.
An opinion poll for Radio 5 Live today shows that 2 months after the referendum, 62% of people in Britain do feel positive about Brexit, although among younger voters, 43% say they've thought about leaving the country. People may still be uncertain about exactly what form Brexit is going to take, but it does now seem increasingly clear it won't include a points-based system to control immigration. Ben Brown, BBC News.
Well, the Prime Minister has repeatedly said that Brexit means Brexit, but it's still far from clear what Brexit will mean and how it will affect the UK's relations with trading partners around the world. But Theresa May is keen to negotiate new deals with the Chinese and with other countries like Australia and India. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landell is at the summit in Hangzhou. James.
Sophie, this summit has been discussing many things, Syria, the global economy, but also Brexit. They can't escape it. And as you said, Theresa May has been rushing around trying to reassure all her world leaders as she introduced herself for the first time. Some of them have been pretty positive, saying, yeah, this is a great opportunity, we can get a new trade deal. But others have been more cautious, saying, look, get on with it, Britain, we need more certainty. At the G20, China has wanted to keep the fireworks outside and not put a step wrong as it stakes its claim to be a key player on the world stage. Above all, it didn't want a row over Brexit with the new British Prime Minister to overshadow the summit. Today, at least, there was anything but a row. When Theresa May met the Australian Prime Minister, he made it clear he wanted an early trade deal with Britain.
Australia is determined to provide Britain with all of the support and assistance that we can. We are such great friends.
That, officials said, could involve expert Australian trade negotiators coming to Britain. It was, Mrs May said, a real opportunity for both countries.
But I'm very clear that it doesn't mean we're going to be inward-looking. In fact, we want to be even more outward-looking around the whole of the world. And obviously Australia, with our long-standing ties and our close relationship, will be one of the first countries we'll be looking to.
Not everyone's been so positive. President Obama's told her US trade with the EU and Pacific countries would come ahead of Britain, and the Japanese have listed their fears about the risks of Brexit. But Mrs May has now met most G20 leaders, including India's Prime Minister, and reassured them that Britain is still open for business. Theresa May has used her first time at a summit like this to tell the world that Britain isn't about to leave the stage, that it still wants to be a key player on economic and security issues, and that she will take Britain out of the EU at her own pace and in her own way.
We can be confident about the fundamental strengths of the UK economy and optimistic about the role we will forge for the UK, building on our strength as a great trading nation in the future. And here in Hangzhou, I've had the chance to talk to other leaders about the role that the United Kingdom will play to advance free trade, to make sure the world's economies work for everyone.
But Brexit and Mrs May have not always been centre stage at this summit, and the Americans have begun meeting EU leaders without Britain at the table. Later today, Mrs May will meet President Xi of China amid tensions over delays to a Chinese-backed nuclear power plant in Somerset. Neither side appear to want a row here, and officials said Mrs May was ready to reassure them that a decision will be made by the end of this month. And at her news conference in the last few minutes, the Prime Minister expressly made that point, that a decision would be made on Hinkley Point in the next month. And she also said that, look, Britain's relationship with China is about more than Hinkley Point. It is what she called a global strategic partnership, and there is, again, she repeated her line that there is now a golden era in relations between both countries. So doing everything she possibly can to play down any sense of a row before that crucial meeting with President Xi in just a short while.
James Landau in China. Thank you. Well, let's go to Westminster now. Our political editor, Deputy Political Editor, Norman Smith. Let's talk about immigration and this points-based system. Vote Leave campaigners wanted. How much of a betrayal is it going to be in hearing the Prime Minister say they're not going to get it?
Well, here's a funny thing, Sophie. Normally, you would expect there to be howls of protest, claims of betrayal, treachery, infamy, because Theresa May has, in effect, kiboshed what was the standout policy demand of the Brexiteers during the referendum campaign by saying, look, forget your points-based immigration system. It's not an option. It wouldn't work. And yet, far from howls of outrage, they've sounded rather meek and accepting of this. Now, why is that? I think in part because the Theresa May honeymoon still rumbles on. I think, too, there's an element of party loyalty. Tory Brexiteers don't want to rock the boat for the new Prime Minister. And above all, because it's early days. They're willing to cut Theresa May a bit of slack. So at the moment, she doesn't really have to spell out what she's going to do. But the clock is ticking, and we're getting a sign of the likely flashpoints ahead. And one, yes, will be, what are you going to do about immigration? Two will be, what about access to the single market? Three, are we still going to be paying money to the EU? And four, when is she going to trigger Article 50 to begin the withdrawal process? So far, answers have we none. Now, this afternoon, we may get some clarity from the Brexit Minister, David Davis, when he makes a statement about Brexit in the Commons. But honestly, I wouldn't hold your breath.
Norman Smith, thank you. Meanwhile, Britain's service industry bounced back strongly last month after a sharp contraction following the vote to leave the EU. In July, the services sector, which accounts for almost 80% of the UK economy, recorded its steepest decline in activity for more than 7 years. But a month later, new figures show a sharp rebound, confounding the predictions of many economists. Here's our correspondent, Andy Verity.
Service companies from coffee shops to cake makers to hairdressers reported a dramatic slowdown a month ago. But now they've made up all the ground they lost and business is growing again. At this site in Alfreton in Derbyshire, where they make sofas for a furniture retailer, they looked for the negative effect they've been warned of, but never found it.
When we talked to people about middle of last month about how we were doing post-Brexit, we actually had to say that for about the 6-7 weeks post the Brexit referendum, things were still going pretty well the same in the market, so we're still pretty optimistic.
The people who work here, who were supposed to fear for their jobs in the event of a vote to leave, weren't worried enough to cut their spending.
I don't personally feel any different, still spending the same money and still doing the same things.
Still spending as we always have, work hard, it's there for spending, isn't it? Enjoying.
Nothing's really changed for me at the moment, but I don't think it has for anybody just yet. I think time will tell.
The executives in service companies who make the buying decisions, the purchasing managers, were asked how business was going. Compared to July, far more reported that output, the amount of services they were carrying out, was up, and that the amount of new business from customers was up. Faced with more expensive labour and raw materials, more are also raising prices. The services sector, everything from restaurants to transport, is defying all the predictions of respectable economists, from the Bank of England that said there could be a recession to the Treasury, which said there'd be an immediate and profound negative impact on the economy. So far, that's not happening.
We're now waking up to the reality that, in fact, nothing as yet has realistically changed. Yes, of course, we're mindful of what could happen over the medium to long term once Article 50 is triggered. But for now, we're getting back to reality that little has immediately changed after the vote. And so we're seeing sentiment rebound, albeit it is still substantially below the levels that we were seeing right at the start of the year.
Longer term, the anxiety about Brexit remains, with large companies uncertain how trade negotiations will play out, hesitating to invest. But the evidence is growing that the worst fears about the economy in the short term were just that, fears.
And Andy is with me now. Last week it was the manufacturing figures that were confounding expectations. This week it is the services sector. This is just a month's figures, but how significant are they?
We keep having the same conversation, don't we? I think quite significant in the sense that they're all supporting this picture that there was a shock post-Brexit, but it was confined to July, really. In August, it seems that things have bounced back. And manufacturing, you could argue, has even been helped by the Brexit vote because it weakened the pound, and that meant that goods were more competitive, as I was explaining to you last week. But it's really interesting now. We've had consumer spending data, we've had jobs data. Consumer spending was supposed to go down, it went up. Joblessness was supposed to go up, it went down. Manufacturing doing a lot better. But we do have to get used to something else which is being reported here, which is prices rising. Because the pound is weak, manufacturers and service companies have to pay more for raw materials when they're bought in dollars or euros. And that cost has to be passed on ultimately. If it's not going to squeeze their profits, it gets passed on to us. So the era that we've now enjoyed for months of falling food prices, for example, that's coming to an end.
Andy, thank you. Well, we'll have more on Brexit Britain later in the programme, and you can also find out much more about the issues raised on the BBC website. Go to bbc.co.uk/Brexit. The Labour MP Keith Vaz is expected to announce tomorrow whether he'll continue chairing the influential Home Affairs Select Committee after the Sunday Mirror published allegations that he'd hired male escorts. The 59-year-old, who's married with 2 children, has criticised the newspaper for printing the story. Our political correspondent Eleanor Garnier reports.
This is not a television game show. This is a serious question about serious issues.
High profile, a powerful politician, and often in the limelight.
Nobody is questioning our integrity. It's your judgment we're questioning.
But after 9 years chairing a Commons committee, Mr Vaz's career is now in trouble. After allegations in the Sunday Mirror that Mr Vaz paid for 2 Eastern European male escorts to visit him one evening last month at a flat he owns in London. According to the paper, Mr Vaz said his name was Jim, a washing machine salesman. It's claimed the men discussed using the party drug poppers. Now, some MPs say his position as committee chair is untenable.
The fact that Keith Vaz is prevaricating over even resigning as chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee when he's brought Parliament into such disrepute and himself, I think is it's amazing.
But others say Mr Vaz should be given some slack.
I think there are issues about his moral standing, I've no doubt about that, and in terms of whether there's any hypocrisy there, but in terms of legalities, I don't believe he's committed any crimes. That's my understanding of the situation. I think we should be very sympathetic, especially to his wife and to his children. They'll be going through hell because of the media attention that they're getting, but also have sympathy for Keith as well.
There's no suggestion Mr Vaz has broken any laws, but his political credibility has been damaged by the allegations over his personal conduct, and there are questions over a possible conflict of interest. The committee Mr Vaz chairs is currently doing an inquiry into prostitution. Mr Vaz, who's married with children, told the Mail on Sunday he was genuinely sorry for the hurt and distress that had been caused. But in a statement given to the BBC, he said it was deeply troubling that a national newspaper should have paid individuals who have acted in this way. I have referred these allegations to my solicitor. The Commons Standards watchdog is now being urged to look into the allegations. The politician, used to scrutinising others, could himself become the subject of an investigation. Ellen Agagna, BBC News, Westminster.
The time is just after 1:15. Our top story this lunchtime. The Prime Minister rules out the idea of an Australian-style points-based immigration system, one of Leave campaigners' key policies in the EU referendum.
Coming up, I'm Jane Hill in Bradford. All day on the BBC, we are taking a look at Brexit Britain and asking what people up and down the country want from the government in light of that vote to leave the EU.
In South today, a boom in tourism along our coast this summer. But what will Brexit mean for our businesses long term? And snapped up, we meet the first girl to win her top Wildlife Photography Award with this action shot.
French lorry drivers, farmers and shopkeepers have caused major problems on the roads around Calais by blocking the main routes into the port. They're demanding that the migrant camp known as the Jungle be closed. Around 9,000 people are living there in squalor. The mayor of Calais is among hundreds of people demonstrating to show their support for the camp's closure. Eurotunnel has advised travellers from Calais to find an alternative route. Our correspondent Richard Galpin is there for us now. Richard.
Well, it certainly is the biggest protest of its kind so far here in Calais, and it's brought together all sorts of different interest groups, including even members of the police. And I think it's a reflection of the growing hostility here towards the refugees and migrants stuck in the camp here. It's also a reflection of what the protesters say is the French government's failure to tackle the issue.
In the early hours of morning, the lorries start rolling from their meeting point near Dunkirk. This a convoy of angry drivers. They want all the refugees and migrants removed from the camp known as the Jungle, because so many are trying to jump into their lorries at the port in the hope of reaching Britain.
Coming to work is a problem. There are stones being thrown at trucks and assaults.
We start working Monday morning stressed. This cannot continue. It is necessary that the camp is dismantled. We know what they are going through. We're not against them. But it has to be dismantled so that we can work properly.
On the motorway, the convoy gets bigger, with farmers joining the protest. And this go-slow is successful. These are now the only vehicles on the carriageway leading to Calais. They have imposed a blockade.
And while these lorry drivers and farmers grind their way slowly from Dunkirk to Calais, another similar protest is taking place on the motorway from the opposite direction, coming from Boulogne. So you can imagine just how much disruption this is causing on the roads here.
And here, closer to the port, there's yet another protest taking place, this time on foot, and with the aim of blockading both the port and the entrance to the Channel Tunnel. Although so far, both are still running normally. Amongst those taking part, business owners and shopkeepers, who all say the presence of so many refugees and migrants is damaging the local economy. They also fear that the smugglers who try to get people inside the lorries are becoming increasingly violent.
The government should have dealt with the problem globally, organised laws allowing the arrest of troublemakers, because today in France the law doesn't allow you to arrest migrants, smugglers and no-border militants, or to impose penalties on them, and we cannot understand this.
Meanwhile, at the camp itself, the refugees and migrants have been advised not to go out onto the streets during the demonstration. People here do fear they could be attacked. They know Calais is a stronghold of the far-right National Front Party. But the organisers of this protest against the refugees and migrants are determined to press ahead and are threatening to continue the blockade if the government fails to give a date for the closure of the camp.
Now, one potential solution being put forward by the authorities recently here in France, and also actually by aid workers, is that the asylum seekers in the camp should actually be able to make their application for asylum in Britain while still here in Calais. But so far, at least, the Home Office in London has rejected this.
Richard Galpin, thank you. The body that regulates the medical profession has warned that patients will suffer if junior doctors in England go ahead with a series of five-day strikes beginning next week. The General Medical Council says the scale of the action planned at such short notice cannot be justified.
It seems to us not plausible that people won't be harmed. People's operations will be put off, appointments will be cancelled. People who are very anxious waiting to see a doctor to be either reassured that they have nothing serious or indeed to have a test that does prove they have something serious, all of those people are potentially being harmed.
Well, our health editor Hugh Pym is here. That's the GMC. Senior doctors were warning of the impact on patients last week. How much pressure is all this putting on junior doctors?
Well, Sophie, I think, yes, the pressure is growing. We had the Medical Royal Colleges last Friday saying the action was disproportionate, and now the GMC, which regulates the medical profession, saying that doctors really should think very hard and maybe put the action off. Interestingly, as you heard there, the worry is that it's the thousands of routine operations being postponed which will cause distress and suffering to patients, as well as the withdrawal of emergency cover. And the GMC is making clear, as it did before the last set of strikes, that in extreme circumstances, for example, if a hospital felt it was getting into trouble on a strike day and wanted to call junior doctors back in and they refused to do so, then action could be taken against those doctors. Now, the BMA, the British Medical Association, has made it clear that patient safety is very important, and it will work with NHS England on the day to ensure that if hospitals really are struggling, that some procedure is invoked to get the doctors back in again. And it says the government could end all this by getting back round the table. But I think it's the fact that it's 5 days rather than 2 and such short notice which is causing real worries at high levels of the NHS. And I gather talks are going on between the BMA and NHS England on that precise point today.
Hugh, thank you. Now, Orkney may be just off the Scottish coast, but it's further north than parts of Sweden. It has a population of just over 20,000, and like many remote communities, the islands have struggled to hold on to young people, many of whom have left in search of work. John Maguire has been to Orkney to meet some of the young people who've bucked the trend and headed back to the islands.
Like much in these islands, Orkney's past is fascinating and justifiably world famous. For centuries, Orcadians have left these unforgiving shores to forge new lives in the new world of countries like Australia and Canada. And in recent times, people talk of Orkney's biggest export as being young people,
Come on, Kay!
putting a strain on traditional industries such as farming. George Drever and neighbour young farmer John Stout tell me how times are changing.
If you're no in line to inherit a farm, like for your father or whatever, it's really hard to try and buy a farm. It's just about impossible unless the old retiring farmer really wants to see you in it and wants to be generous and give you a good start.
Orkney has less 16 to 29-year-olds than the rest of Scotland, but more over 60s. While some of the islands here are struggling, others thrive. Westray now has several young families, new blood, but some from an old lineage.
what's going on, Murray?
Kara's Baird has returned to the island of her birth and to a former family business.
This shop was owned by my great-granddad, so when the opportunity came up, we took a bit of thinking, and because we had a lot to leave behind, obviously, on the mainland, friends and jobs and things, but we're delighted to be back.
It's a 90-minute ferry ride back to the mainland where most of Orkney's 22,000 people live. Long-term predicted population growth here is 5.5%. The UK's is almost 3 times that. I meet 2 young people who left, but came back.
I went to live in Edinburgh, where I studied at university. My heart was always in Orkney, so I chose to come back here, completely change my career path and find a job that would give me a long-term career here in Orkney.
On some of the outlying islands, there are concerns over whether farming can provide for the higher standard of living expected by a modern family. But one solution is modern. High-speed internet brings with it potential employment opportunities. It's something they're very aware of here, and may well help this people, renowned for their sense of adventure and travel, to instead stay at home. John Maguire, BBC News, Orkney.
And finally, throughout the day, BBC News is taking its most detailed look at Brexit Britain since the referendum. We can go now to Jane Hill, who is in Bradford for us. Jane.
Sophie, thank you. Welcome to Bradford, where all day we are finding out what people want from the government now that the decision has been taken to leave the EU, and how they feel about that decision. We're getting a sense of it up and down the country as well. So to that end, our reporter Seb Chowdhury has been to Weston-super-Mare, where the vote there mirrored the national vote, 52% to leave versus 48% to remain. He's been talking to some of the town's Brexit's winners and losers.
The cellar of the Midland Hotel on Western seafront.
Carl.
Hiya.
How can I help you?
Hungarian national Carl has been here for 3 years. As well as the laundry, he has a variety of jobs.
Why did you decide to come to England?
I heard many good things about the UK from my friends, about the opportunities for work, about the countryside, about nice people.
Would you come to Britain now knowing that it had left the EU?
I think not, because I would be afraid the local people don't want to accept me as a foreign worker.
This area mirrored the national referendum split. 52% voted to leave, in a place where many British people won't take the seasonal jobs on offer. Half the staff at this hotel are from the EU.
After the referendum, did your staff come to you for advice then?
They did. They were worried. They said, Keith, what are we going to do? What's going to happen to us? And I said, nothing's going to happen to you. You've got your permits, you're paying national insurance and tax.
There was a real panic then?
There was a real panic. They were really worried, yeah.
Some people might argue that if the European workers had to go home, that there would be English workers to fill those jobs.
When I was advertising for staff before they came, I didn't have anyone coming up for the jobs, or they only lasted 1 day.
Louis.
Hello, sir. Nice to meet you.
You got me an ice cream.
Even Weston's established migrant communities are worried. Louis McRides was born and bred in this town.
This is your home.
Part of a thriving Greek Cypriot community which arrived in the late 1960s and now own many bars and cafes here.
Things like the vote can bring out the worst in people. There is a problem, an underlying problem, where the green light was given to people that had something to say that kept it to themselves.
Were your family worried about it?
I do feel that when they're walking down the street now, they look over their shoulder a little bit.
Away from the seafront, here on the Bourneville estate, immigration isn't an issue for everyone who voted out. For Joy, it's brought hope.
Having waited 40 years to get my hands on a polling card to give me another chance, there's no way that was going into my recycling box.
That's your card.
So, just as a joke, I framed it.
Let's talk about immigration. How much of a factor did it play for you?
Not a great deal, because for me it was all about sovereignty and not being dictated to or governed by anybody else other than our own elected leaders.
The economy relies on a lot of migrant workers coming in. Employers have said young English people don't want those jobs.
I think if they tried it, they would find that perhaps, even if it was long hours for the minimum wage, that actually going out to work and do something and bringing home money at the end of the month was something they could get used to.
There are mixed feelings about the decision to leave the European Union, but what is clear is that there is a sense of positivity, that whatever happens, we have to make it work. Seb Chowdhury, BBC News.
Well, we're going to be testing opinion just like that all day here in Bradford as part of the BBC's Brexit Britain Day. And also worth telling you that if you're watching in England, you can see a special edition of Inside Out this evening, specifically looking at the vote to leave the EU. That's 7:30 this evening on BBC One, special editions of Inside Out. And of course, wherever you are in the country, you can see all those programmes later on the iPlayer. So much more from here all day. But for now, Sophie, back to you.
Jane, thank you. Time now for a look at the weather with Louise Lear. The sunshine's gone.
I know, it's a Monday morning. The last thing, Sophie, you want is us standing there using words like grey, drab, drizzly. Unfortunately, that's what happened for most of us this Monday morning. As you can see by this Weather Watchers picture in Devon, a lot of low cloud and some coastal mist, and it was drizzly as well. But there has been a little bit of sunshine, not too bad in Durham first thing this morning. You really have been the favoured few because for most of it there's been a lot of low grey cloud around, and that cloud producing some bits and pieces of drizzle. The drizzle now starting to ease away up into the far northeast as well. Showery outbreaks of rain clearing away from the north and east of Scotland, and through the afternoon we keep that cloud for most. There might be a little bit of brightness starting to develop, favoured spots Northern Ireland, and temperatures responding 22 degrees. And despite the cloud, it's not that cold out there. In fact, there's quite a humid feel, but along those coasts, well, the cloud thick enough for the odd spot or two of drizzle, some coastal murk as well. But into the lee of high ground, you might just get to see a little bit of sunshine if you're lucky. Highest values really of around 19 to 22 today. Any holes in the cloud, they'll quickly disappear as we go through this evening. We'll see more cloud returning. We'll see more coastal fog and some hill fog as well. And maybe the cloud thick enough for the odd spot or two of drizzle. But an incredibly mild night for many. Perhaps 19 degrees in Northern Ireland. That could be a record low for this time of year in terms of the temperature. Now, this weather front will continue to bring in some drizzly rain into Northern Ireland, central and southern Scotland. To the north and east of that, we might see a little bit of sunshine coming through. To the south, still the emphasis with a good deal of cloud around, but if you get the cloud breaking up, the temperatures are really going to respond. So if you get some sunshine, we could see 25, 77 Fahrenheit. Generally, we're likely to see the low 20s for many. Now, as we move out of Tuesday into Wednesday, that weather front pushes its way north. The high pressure drifts off to the east, and it allows the wind direction to change. Not coming in off the Atlantic, we lose that humidity. Still a lot of heat in the near continent, but it's drier air as we move through the middle of the week. And as a consequence, hopefully, fingers crossed, that should help to break up the cloud a little more, I suspect, on Wednesday. And so the temperatures will respond. We could see highs of 27 degrees. If that leads you into a big groan, then most of us will perhaps see temperatures low to mid-20s. So just to recap, today and tomorrow, it's messy out there. It's grey, it's drab, it's not particularly pleasant, but it's warm and humid. As we move into Wednesday, it looks as though it will be pretty hot with some sunshine coming through. Fingers crossed, that's the story, Sophie.
Thank you. A reminder now of our main story this lunchtime. The Prime Minister rules out the idea of an Australian-style points system-based immigration system, one of Leave campaigners' key policies in the EU referendum. And at 4:30 this afternoon, there's a special Brexit Britain discussion programme from Nottingham on the BBC News channel and 5 Live. That's all from us, though. Now on BBC One, time for the news where you are. Bye-bye.